the 25th of April 2018, Jason humiliated Lewis by making fun of his job in front of their friends.
2 weeks later, Lewis invited all of his friends to his 25th birthday party via email, except for Jason.
One could view Lewis not inviting Jason to his party as tit for tat. You wronged me, so I'll wrong you. Yet there is more at play here. Why not just humiliate Jason back and move on? This is because Jason is now a threat to Lewis's status. The once established hierarchy is now unstable. Lewis's status has been undermined. Let's look at what's going on in his brain as his status shifts. Zink and colleagues offers insight into the differences in neuroprocessing between humans who are in a stable hierarchy versus those who are in an unstable hierarchy, and the consequent brain activity when viewing a superior opponent. In Experiment 1, participants were 2-star players who consistently lost to the 3-star player and conquered the 1-star player. Thus, they understood that they were a middle player and the hierarchy was stable. In Experiment 2, participants started out as the middle player. However, they unexpectedly sometimes lost to the lower-ranking player and beat the higher-ranking player. This changed and shifted their status and rank in the competition, and hence created the unstable hierarchy. After each experiment, participants viewed images of the superior opponent, the opponent who beat them. fMRI scans found that in both conditions, there was an increased activity in the occipital and parietal cortex, the parahippocampal cortex, and the ventral striatum, indicating that participants required greater attentional processing of the superior players. However, in the unstable hierarchy condition, there was additional activity in the amygdala, indicating a stronger threat response. There was also more activation in the medial PFC rather than the dorsolateral PFC, suggesting greater emotional processing rather than cognitive control and executive processing. From the results of Zink and colleagues, we can expect Lewis to have increased attentional processing within his parietal and occipital cortex, his parahippocampal cortex, and his ventral striatum. However, we can also expect greater activity in the medial PFC to encode for mentalizing the intentions of others, such as Jason and his friend group, as well as in his amygdala, which likely sparked a threat response within Lewis.
Now, to further understand what may have influenced the activity in these brain regions, it is important we consider what was going on in Lewis's environment in the minutes leading up to his behavior. One key contributor to this behavior may have been the use of email to exclude Jason from his party. When we saw Lewis adding in his friends' emails alone in his house, only their email addresses and not their photos popped up on the screen. There are a multitude of studies demonstrating that the presence of watchful eyes elicits more pro-social behavior in participants. Studies have demonstrated in the presence of pictures of eyes, participants are more likely to pick up their litter and pay more to honesty boxes. In front of paintings of eyes, they donate more money in the hopes of enhancing their reputation, and even donate more money in the presence of 3 dots on a screen configured to look like eyes. Therefore, due to the lack of social gaze to detect in the minutes leading up to the behavior, Lewis may have been less primed to act in a pro-social manner, making his ostracism of Jason a more salient option.
What inclined Lewis to ostracize Jason from the friendship group? Ultimately, this was an action not about revenge, but about social status. As a 25-year-old male in a friendship group of handsome young roosters such as these men, Lewis is constantly faced with the task of having to understand a social hierarchy and maintain his rank within it. Not only was Lewis humiliated by Jason's remarks, it was a threat to his social status within the friend group. The challenge hypothesis posits that situational cues of competition, especially those related to status, triggers a rise in testosterone in young men. This, in turn, encourages them to compete for their status. Thus, we can expect Lewis to have a surge of testosterone due to the competitive situation he has found himself in with Jason. This surge is coupled with Lewis's high basal testosterone, as testosterone peaks in young adulthood for men. Intuitively, we would expect for this high level of testosterone to increase dominant and aggressive behavior within Lewis. However, Lewis takes a rather avoidant, passive approach to Jason's insults by ostracizing and eliminating him. This is due to an interesting blocking effect that cortisol has on testosterone. Research has consistently found that cortisol levels rise after a loss or defeat dependent on testosterone levels. Mehta and colleagues demonstrates this relationship, where handlers for a dog competition with high testosterone pre-competition saw a rise in cortisol after they lost. You can see here that on this graph, those who had high testosterone before the contest had the highest spikes in cortisol once they lost. Meanwhile, those who had high testosterone and won had a massive drop in cortisol. In comparison, those who didn't have high baseline levels of testosterone didn't see any cortisol effects. We can consider Lewis to have lost this social competition with Jason, thus causing a spike in cortisol. Josephson and Mehta took the previous experiment one step further. Not only did it look at the changing levels of testosterone and cortisol pre and post defeat, but it looked at whether the defeated participants requested a rematch. In this study, researchers measured pre-task testosterone and post-task cortisol. Participants who were defeated in the task were given the opportunity to compete again. The results saw that 100% of the participants with high testosterone and low cortisol sought a rematch to mend their damaged status. Conversely, 100% of participants with high testosterone and high cortisol rejected a rematch. This demonstrated that even though basal testosterone may be high, it can still be blocked by a rise in cortisol. This is because the behaviors that testosterone drives, such as mating, competition, and aggression, may be fatal during a survival situation. Fight or flight behaviors that are produced by cortisol, on the other hand, can be far more necessary. If Jason humiliating Lewis was a social defeat, did Lewis request a rematch, or did he concede defeat? Was it fight or was it flight?
Now, I'm not a violent man, but I would have punched that in the head.
If it were me, I just would have said, hey man, Jason, that ain't cool.
Now I would have confronted him. None of this scaredy cat not inviting you nonsense. That's how we did it back in my day.
Lewis, in an attempt to maintain status, did not rise to rematch Jason. He took the easy road out by eliminating Jason, rather than confronting him. This is due to a cortisol spike after his social loss, which blocked the dominance effects of Lewis's high baseline testosterone. Nevertheless, Lewis still took calculated action to maintain his social status, even if they were not dominant or aggressive. This is in line with the challenge hypothesis, which posits that an agent will do whatever it takes to maintain social status. Therefore, Lewis used a more avoidant, passive strategy to eliminate the threat of Jason's presence on his social status and reclaim his social ranking within the friend group.
The late adolescent brain is undergoing a number of changes, and for males, testosterone is understood to be peaking. Studies in adults have shown that increased testosterone can decrease the communication and coupling between the amygdala and the orbitofrontal cortex. In an fMRI study, adolescents were exposed to faces that represented a neutral or threatening response. They found that during the threatening face condition, an increase in testosterone over a 2-year study period was correlated with less coupling of the amygdala in areas of the OFC. They suggested that this may result in a reduced top-down regulation of the amygdala by the OFC, meaning that the amygdala has more control. In the case of Lewis and Jason, we can understand that Lewis felt threatened by Jason's behavior, and due to his increased testosterone levels, he made a response with the reactivities of his amygdala acting more out of fear of getting hurt again, and his OFC was not able to intervene to evaluate the behavior in a different way. Brain development can change for more than just normative adolescent development, and unfortunately for Lewis, his authoritarian parents meant he has struggled to build strong relationships with his peers.
Now, when Lewis was a little boy, he wanted to cuddle and all this. And I said, no, we're not doing that. We're not going to do that, Lou.
Lewis is understood to have a temperament mirroring that of behavioral inhibition at times, explaining his behavior to withdraw from novel, threatening situations, such as inviting a rude friend to your party. In a longitudinal study following up on infants categorized for their temperament, researchers gathered data on behavioral inhibition, parenting styles, and neuroimaging during a peer evaluation task among adolescents. They found that in the authoritarian parenting group, adolescents with behavioral inhibition had decreased VLPFC activity during the peer rejection task. The VLPFC is important in learning appropriate behaviors to threatening or rewarding stimuli with strong connections to the amygdala. It can be understood that Lewis felt threatened by Jason and his VLPFC may have been less active, causing him to avoid Jason in line with the behavioral inhibition. A recent study on 18 to 25-year-olds measured the functional coupling of the OFC and basolateral amygdala in emotional regulation. They used an emotional regulation questionnaire to measure the use of cognitive reappraisal and expressive suppression strategies in daily life. They then showed emotionally valent picture stimuli, both negative and neutral, and asked participants to passively view the stimuli, allowing any emotions to arise. They then rated the affective state and rated the extent to which they'd used emotional regulation strategies during the exercise. Cognitive reappraisal is a strategy that can modify one's emotional response by re-evaluating the meaning of an event or stimulus, and it can be understood that Lewis did not engage in a reappraisal, otherwise he may not have taken Jason's comment as a personal insult and may instead have taken it as a joke. The study found that reappraisal scores were positively correlated with an increase in functional coupling of the OFC and right BLA. They found that coupling partially mediated the association between reappraisal and emotional responses, suggesting that the OFC may be necessary to regulate the BLA and change the emotional response during a reappraisal. As was discussed in the previous studies, Lewis is likely to have less coupling of the OFC and amygdala due to testosterone and less VLPFC likely from his upbringing, was therefore acting out of fear and the appraisal that he had been insulted, and was not able to respond and act in a measured way with the influence and assistance from the prefrontal cortex.
Another potential cause we can examine for Lewis's behavior is the culture he was raised in. A person's culture plays a huge role in their behavior, as culture influences social behavioral norms, beliefs, and cognitions. Our culture works like a map or a reference book whereby we use it to understand our world, make sense of what we see, and decide how to act in different situations. To decide, was that a joke or an insult I just heard? For example, let's look at how culture, by influencing social norms, may have predicted Lewis's choosing to ostracize Jason in response to being insulted. A recent study by Rudder and colleagues in 2023 looked at motives for ostracism across two manipulated contexts. Relevant to our discussion, as you can see in this bar graph here, they found that participants expecting an upcoming cooperative task were more likely to ostracize a described person for a social norm violation which posed a threat to group cohesion than for their poor performance on a non-social math task. Conversely, when expecting an upcoming performance-based task, they were more likely to ostracize a described person with poor performance on a math task than someone who violated a social norm. The authors found that the motive for ostracism was often linked to the goals of the group, as Lewis's friend group would be considered a cooperative context. If Jason's insult was considered a social norm violation threatening their group cohesion, we would predict that Lewis would be more likely to ostracize Jason as a result. Lewis and his friends who were from Alabama were raised in the American South, which is well known for its culture of honor. In a culture of honor, your reputation is paramount, and if threats to your reputation aren't responded to, your honor can be significantly damaged. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that people from honor cultures are always going to be more confrontational. A study in the Netherlands compared participants from an ethnic minority honor culture to participants from the native majority dignity culture and had them read about different conflict situations that either contained an insult or no insult. They were then asked to rate the level of perceived conflict for each scenario and also the extent to which they would engage in different behaviors in response, such as cooperative conflict resolution behavior. As you can see in the graph here, the participants from the honor culture perceived higher conflict when an insult was present. Conversely, when an insult was absent, they were more likely to try and engage in cooperative conflict resolution behaviors. The authors believed that this is because in honor cultures, if you engage in a conflict when it is not necessary, in this case, if an insult is absent, you risk a loss in front of others, which risks your reputation and social standing. What this study demonstrates is that culture is an important determinant of if something is considered a conflict not worth overlooking, and for honor culture, these conflicts often involved an insult. In Lewis's case, Jason did insult him in front of the group by making fun of his job. Therefore, Jason has violated the social norm of not only Lewis, but his group of friends who share an honor culture in which an insult is a threat to one's reputation and social standing. It runs against the goal for group cohesion and therefore likely motivated Lewis to decide to ostracize Jason to restore his reputation and avoid future situations where he may risk his reputation being threatened again.
Immediately, Lewis sensed a threat to his social ranking, and his amygdala and medial PFC are firing.
There is now an unstable hierarchy and no watchful eyes. Lewis does not prioritize prosociality.
The social competition made testosterone through the roof, but cortisol flew in after that social loss, eliminating the dominance effects.
He's the product of authoritarian parents in late adolescence, and his amygdala and frontal cortex regions are still in the texting phase. He's seeing puppies and calling them wolves.
Combine all this in a southern man of honor, and a simple joke is seen as an insult threatening to destroy his status and tear apart his crew.